Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ramani and welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism, narcissistic relationships, and healing from narcissistic relationships. We're going to talk about the tricky topic of self-sabotage and how it shows up in narcissistically abusive relationships. I mean, one thing to remember about psychology is that there are no absolutes, and there's no absolutes even in healing from narcissistic abuse. And not all survivors do this, but many survivors will reflect on, "Oh, I'm doing myself wrong. I keep sort of, I feel like I'm my worst enemy." So what's that about? Right? This is a video. Really, this video is about people who are already out of narcissistic relationships. It might be that you're no contact, you're light contact, maybe it's parents who are deceased or parents you rarely see or siblings you rarely see, but you're mostly out. Obviously, if you're still in a narcissistic relationship, I am really, really reluctant to call any of these behaviors self-sabotage because so often in those relationships, in narcissistic relationships, you're being so actively sabotaged by the narcissistic person that you may sometimes just take the fall and end up in these sort of so-called self-sabotaging patterns from a trauma-bonded place or just to keep the peace. I think talking about self-sabotage while people are still in narcissistic relationships runs the risk of shaming a person for a dynamic that is firmly based in the existing narcissistic relationship dynamics. But what if you do get out of the relationship and it's years later and you still find yourself caught in patterns like perfection and procrastinating too long, or talking yourself out of taking a reasoned risk, or not throwing your hat in the ring for a new opportunity, or simply holding back? Is that self-sabotage? Survivors of narcissistic abuse find this happening to themselves over and over again. So let's break this down. Narcissistic relationships change your emotional DNA, even if you're no longer in them, and especially if you had primary narcissistic relationships in childhood through a parent. The invalidation of the narcissistic abuse, coupled with your own temperament, can be a really tricky combination, especially if you are someone who may have higher temperamental levels of anxiety to begin with. I do believe that for many survivors of narcissistic abuse, self-sabotage, in a way, is like a safety behavior. It's actions that you may actually engage in a sort of strange self-protective manner. You procrastinate, and not only do you protect yourself from disappointment, but the internalized voice of the narcissistic person saying, "Oh, come on, you're really trying for that? Who do you really think you are? Really, you think you're all of that? Are you sure you want to apply for that? No, I'm not so sure you're ready." Those internalized voices of the narcissistic people in our lives are the true saboteurs. And the key is to recognize that if those people are no longer in your life, that those voices are really no longer real. When we self-sabotage, we are typically trying to protect ourselves from hurt, disappointment, and loss, uncomfortable things. The things that we believe would happen if we tried and failed, or tried and would get found out. Narcissistic relationships are places where we have the experience and truly believe we're not enough. Or we get the message that if we do try to be our own person, independent from the relationship, or just be our own person, that we'll lose other people. "Oh, I guess you don't need us anymore." Or that if we outshine the narcissist or do better than them at anything, that they will leave, and we might even feel guilty about doing better than them. The hijacking of self and identity that happens in these relationships means that we learn to silence ourselves, even when these relationships are behind us or the people are no longer around, because in their wake, their narratives actually shaped us. And to do something like put ourselves out there or attempt to succeed is actually a betrayal of the narcissistic relationship. And even if the relationship is long gone, it's still in our head. Self-sabotage operates under our conscious radar. Listen, we're not sitting at home, rubbing our hands together and saying, how can I screw up my life and keep myself stuck forever? When we self-sabotage, as it were, we're often on autopilot and like, listen, I hate how many people these days talk about mindfulness in that new age way, because actually mindfulness is cool. It's so useful in healing from narcissistic abuse, but it doesn't have to be candles and chanting and meditation. Mindfulness really means getting out of your head and just being fully present. When you brew your cup of coffee, when you feed your cat, you can be fully present in that moment and aware, and it can be a mindful experience. Narcissistic relationships, especially long-term ones that were laden with betrayal and chronic gaslighting and invalidation, can leave us mildly dissociated, sort of with our head in the clouds, and we aren't present. We're ruminating. We're playing our self-doubt tape in our heads. And when we do that, we miss the moment, which is everything. Self-sabotage happens when we are on autopilot. Because if you could be mindful, and when you're not doing the application or whatever it is, and recognize and say, wait, am I procrastinating because I'm afraid of putting myself out there? Or am I still hearing their voice in my head? I guess I am afraid of failing. I guess I am afraid of succeeding. And then you may catch yourself and say, oh, come on, I got to put this behind me. I just have to do this. In fact, being mindful and catching yourself is such a key part of healing. It's a way of telling the voices of the narcissistic people in your life to go F themselves and separate their version of you from your true you. It saddens me when I recognize how many people held and hold themselves back because of these internalized processes. But when you can frame self-sabotage within that larger context, it's less about, ugh, I'm just that person who self-sabotages, and more about, I am still carrying the weight of that invalidation and confusion and self-doubt. It's important to not take on the identity that you're just simply a self-saboteur, but rather that you're a person who has been through something that scrambled your belief in yourself. Narcissistic relationships are paradoxical. It's strange. In these relationships, you're afraid of failing. You're afraid of the criticism and anger, mocking, contempt, loss of love if you fail. But you're also afraid of succeeding. The shame, guilt, fear of abandonment being minimized if you succeed. You can't win. Narcissistic relationships are an eternal catch-22. The self-sabotage can often fall within the space of recognizing there was never a safe direction to turn into. So it may have just felt safest to just do nothing. And that is often what self-sabotage is. Not doing anything and remaining stuck. And that sort of frozenness in place is how many of us can get stuck in narcissistic relationship cycles for years. Thanks again.